Welcome everyone to the first episode of the ThinkingWest Podcast on Plato's Apology. I'm your humble host and fellow student of the greats, Christian Bonfield. The goal of the ThinkingWest Podcast is namely to explore the foundational works and ideas of the Western world and using our modern technology at our disposal, e.g. YouTube and potentially other podcasting avenues as I see forward. I'll initially start with YouTube as my main platform, but then expand as time goes on. This episode is all about Plato's Apology, and kind of where this episode and all future episodes in the series are going to go is it's going to begin with a synopsis to get us all on the same page. So if you haven't read the work in a few years, or if you've never read it, or if you've read it very recently, you can at least put down some points to all kind of have a common point of reference. Then I'll go into the historical scene, what is going on at the time of this work's writing, or the subject of the writing. Then I'll go into some bio of those involved. In this case, it's going to be Plato, the writer, and Socrates, the subject of apology. And then we're going to go into the real meat and the real point behind these podcast episodes, which is mainly these open questions that I'm going to introduce, and they're going to be of a very philosophic nature in general, but sometimes of a more pragmatic, practical in nature as well. And the goal is to start a discussion using our modern means through video or podcast or just the audio in many of your cases. To begin that discussion, it's really that third part of the trivium of a classical education. You kind of first read the work, then you process it internally, and then you begin to discuss it with another person. And a lot of times, we don't have the opportunity to discuss it with anyone else. So this channel, its goal is to serve as the kind of proxy for that third part of the trivium. Even if you're not trying to do a classical education, it's commentary, but it's also opening up discussion based on the ideas in the works we're going to be talking about. I'm beginning with Plato's Apology because it's often considered the fundamental root of a Western civilization, although it doesn't encompass a lot of Western philosophy in general. Excuse me there. But it does serve as kind of the first place maybe a lot of philosophy 101 classes might begin, especially in the Western world. And that's another thing I'll note. Thinking West, of course, as the title suggests, is mainly focused on the foundational works of the West rather than of other cultures in perhaps the eastern side of the world. Not because there's nothing worth it there. There may be times in the future where we'll expand and kind of cover those topics as well, but mainly because I personally am not that familiar with them, and most of the listeners here on this Thinking West podcast will likely be from a Western world type background, given that I'm namely just speaking English first of all. But the real goal is to get you guys involved in the comments if possible. That's where we can really begin to have more of a conversation. Otherwise, it's just a monologue, so please feel free to comment away, whether on the topic or about the video itself, whatever you want to talk about. But I will hope to see some good answers and input about the open questions I'm going to open up into later on the podcast. Lastly, be sure to like and subscribe the video. Of course, that's highly important for getting this out there just so other people can see it, so I really appreciate it. Thanks. As promised, the first thing we're going to start with is a synopsis of the trial of Socrates, which is the subject of the Apology. This trial of Socrates goes on in the year 399 BC, so quite some time ago. What's that, 2,400 years ago approximately? And it's Plato's Apology is written by Plato of Socrates' trial before the government of Athens, where this takes place. I actually have personal ties to Athens, as my grandfather grew up there before immigrating to the United States. Now Plato argues, Socrates argues in his case that he had done no wrong by his honest pursuit of the truth. The council, unfortunately, despite all his defenses, had found him guilty, since his teachings are thought to be a danger to the youth of Athens. That was just one of the accusations. We'll really get into more of those accusations. And again, in this, we're not going to be exhaustive on every topic, and I'd further like to note that I'm not a historian nor some literary expert. I'm merely a reader of these books, these works, and I prefer to use the term commenter or commentator, if you kind of use a sports analogy. I will comment on these works. I'm not providing the end-all, be-all truth about these works, and I don't think anyone can fairly claim to do that about any of these works, especially when you get into the philosophy of it all. Regardless, the council find him guilty. They condemn him to death at nearly the will of Socrates, as you'll see later. He really accepts it with quite open arms, rather than being, for example, exiled, as could have been another punishment. Socrates places a very high emphasis on maintaining his integrity to his teachings and philosophy, rather than saving himself merely in a physical way. But the way this apology really starts out, it starts off with Socrates explaining how he visited the oracle at Delphi. It might be pronounced Delphi, I'm not quite sure. I know the Greek letter phi is usually pronounced phi rather than phi, so I would think this might be Delphi. But I'm not an expert in Greek either, so I'm just going to call it Delphi because it sounds just a little nicer to me. But he through another member, one of his friends named Chaerephon, I believe, this Chaerephon character went to the oracle at Delphi and asked who was the wisest, at least of all the Greeks. I'm not sure if it was the entire world or not. And the oracle at Delphi said, it's Socrates. There is no man wiser than he. That's quite a shocking answer, you've got to imagine, if you hear that as Socrates. Whether he, perhaps he fabricated it. Regardless, that's how the story goes. So Socrates, in order to try to prove this oracle wrong, because he didn't quite believe it according to his account in the Apology, he questions politicians, poets, artisans, and in the process makes many enemies. Claims to be the great gadfly. I think of this as something like a horsefly growing up in the south. If you ever went swimming, the horseflies were just horrendous while you're trying to enjoy a hot summer day in the pool. But he described himself as this great gadfly that stirs this slow, cumbersome state into action, into self-reflection about its ways. And then he offers his defense against several accusations. One being a misleader of the youth, another being he was called an atheist, which at this time was apparently a crime, or at least close enough to a crime to earn him the ire of the Athenian people. The court votes to condemn him, I believe, by around 30 votes, from what I read in his account, if I remember that correctly, and with the punishment of death proposed and eventually sentenced. That's kind of the lay of the land of the Apology. It's his defense in court. It's a legal defense, rather than he's not apologizing, as the term seems to suggest. He's not apologizing for anything. On the contrary, this term apology here is meant to mean a defense. The same as in apologetics for, say, if you're defending the Christian faith or some other faith. That apologetics term is not to say, sorry, we believe this. It's to say, this is what we believe and why. It's defending, not what we think of as apologizing today. Now, with that kind of brief synopsis, again, it's not a perfect synopsis. There's certainly things left out there, but some of those will be brought in more later, and we'll see some direct quotes, especially when we get into some of the open questions. But I would like to set the historical scene about what's going on in the Greek world at this time. Because I think it's highly important to really understand the absolute chaos that was going on in Athens, and people being slaughtered just a few decades before this for political reasons and all sorts of things. But we'll get into that quickly. The first thing is the Peloponnesian War, which unfortunately my history background was less than enough. But the Peloponnesian War was a war between Athens and many of its coastal allies, and then Sparta. Really the two most famous Greek city-states, in my opinion. Probably the only two I could have named prior to getting into this this stuff was Athens and Sparta. You could think of Athens as mainly a seafaring nation. Not that they were always that way, but they developed a very strong navy at some point, and were very known for their naval power. And they're going to use that naval power in this Peloponnesian War to try to win this. Sparta, on the other hand, not a naval-faring city-state. So they're largely going to launch a land war, and that's kind of reflected in this image here, this map. These are all common license images I pull from no secret sources here. But this map really shows kind of the overall strategy of the Peloponnesian War. Not that it's particularly important to Plato, but I like to provide some of this extra commentary along the way, because I thought it was interesting when I ran across it. To see the level of detail that we actually can know about some of these battles from the writings of the times. But the Athenian strategy, as suggested here in this box, is defend on land, since they don't have they can't beat Sparta in an open battlefield, I don't think. I think that's the idea here. But they have a strong sea, so they're going to use that sea to attack the coasts against Sparta, which is in this red circle here, and its allies in green. And then the orange here is the Athenian Empire, basically. It's Athens and its allies, mainly coastal, as you see. But I like this map because it just gives a brief idea of the overall, the overall strategies of each of these city-states, and that's something I don't think we get much of an idea when we just read a textbook. We don't get an idea of the actual strategy that goes in, and I like this because it kind of emphasizes the nature of the two city-states, Athens and Sparta. In Sparta, of course, we just think of the battle at Thermopylae with the 300, but I think that also is a useful image because it brings that strong land power, that strong ability to win on a battlefield with soldiers versus ships. So Sparta certainly has a reputation as quite the military city-state, as you can read later if you read Plutarch. Highly suggest reading the specific section on Lycurgus and about that Greek city-state, Sparta. This next map I really appreciate because while that first one was kind of far oversimplified, this one really gives a more realistic picture about the complexity of the Peloponnesian War. And this was, I believe, the state of Greece and surrounding areas just up until the Peloponnesian War, I believe. But again, in blue are Sparta and its allies, and in red are Athens and its allies. And you really just get a better feeling of the scale of the conflict from this image, just because of one, a level of detail, but two, it also shows the areas out to Italy and Sicily, which Sicily ended up being a big attack point for Athens and its navy as well. But I like this also because it highlights the other powers in this world at this time, being mainly Thrace, Illyria, which I haven't heard much about, to be fair, and of course the Persian Empire. But also like the other detail and how many islands there really are in this area, and why such having a strong naval power like Athens did is so important. Because just look at the sheer number of islands throughout this Aegean Sea. I knew of Crete, I knew of Rhodes here, and I forget the name of this other island. I was aware of these three, but I was never aware of how many small islands really dot the Aegean Sea here. And you can imagine that naval power just becomes overbearing for anybody trying to resist the Athenian navy in this area. And that's why I believe these allies ultimately are all in league with Athens. Again, not a historian, commenting on my perception of what's going on here. All right, but that kind of sets the main historical scene for right before that. I believe I jumped ahead a little bit. I'll leave it here on the Peloponnesian map until we get to Plato, because he'll come in later when we discuss the people involved. But this Peloponnesian War ultimately did not go the way of Athens very well. The Athenian Empire was shattered after this war. And interestingly, Athens was originally planned to be overthrown by many of many of its enemies, meaning its entire city might be destroyed and its people enslaved to the other city-states. But interestingly, Sparta, who seems to have a very high sense of right and wrong, or at least what is noble and not noble, was very against this enslavement of the Athenian people, and ultimately merely installed some of their own government, basically. They overthrew the democracy and put in this oligarchy. But with the Athenian Empire shattered, we go into the next period of note, which is the Tyranny of the 30. This is some pro-Spartan oligarchy, again, that was placed there after the crushing defeat of Athens from Sparta. And again, I don't think I mentioned this, but most of that battle between Sparta and Athens came down to a point called Attica here, and that's where their land forces really met. This was the major point of kind of where the Athens had to hold the line at Attica there. Just thought I'd throw that in before I really left the topic there. But this Tyranny of the 30 came out to be a very infamous moment in the history of Athens. It was exceedingly cruel under this oligarchy. They really did not hold any punches against the people of Athens. Very cruel, resulting in the death of something like 5% of the Athenian population. And we hear throughout some of the other writings of the Greeks where, so-and-so has lost a friend to the Tyranny of the 30. So it hit nobles as well as rebel rabble alike. Resulted in the confiscation of a lot of property of the Athenians, forced exile of pro-democracy Athenians, but it only lasted around 8 months, so it was very short and sweet, luckily for the Athenian people. And interestingly, Socrates, the subject of our apology here, is thought to have some ties to the 30, and this may have actually played a part in his bad reputation and perhaps his ultimate execution, though it wasn't directly for that reason. But he may have had some ties to the leadership of the 30. And the one way we see this is that one of his students, named Critias, again, not a linguistics expert either here, so if I mispronounce some of the Greek names, you'll just have to forgive me and bear with me. Maybe correct me in the comments so I can at least learn something. But yes, his student Critias was one of the 30, so he did have a tie through that means. Although, one of 30, it's hard to say, how strong of a tie that is, even if it's even enough to really win much favor. I'm not sure. But this Tyranny of the 30 ended with fierce civil strife between the oligarchs and democrats in what was called the Year of Anarchy, which happened between 404 and 403 BC. And it's a rebellion led by Thrasybulus, who was exiled earlier but came back with some strong rebel force and ultimately overthrew the oligarchs. Again, yes, this is a strife between oligarchs and democrats, of course. Don't confuse Democrats with the modern-day Democrats. These Democrats were pro-pure democracy, whereas, of course, in the United States we have a democratic republic, where we have representation through certain individuals that we elect democratically. But these Democrats were for pure democracy, which is often simplified for our system in the U.S., but that's not ultimately correct. I like to clarify that as well. All right, with that, I think we've gone through some of the highlights of what was going on in these Greek city-states at the time. Basically, big war between Sparta and Athens led to this Tyranny of 30, which ultimately has led to this major confusion and ongoing battle between the oligarchs and democrats around the time of Socrates and Plato. Now we can go into the people of Socrates and Plato. So let me switch here. We're going to start with Plato, who is the writer of this work. though he was born after Socrates. And ultimately, we don't really know much about Socrates, so there's not a whole lot to say about his life, unfortunately. Most of what we know from Plato. Plato was born in 428 BC, and interestingly, he was not just a mere rabble of the Athenian city-state. He was from a quite distinguished family, which interestingly had an alleged ancestor that included the god Poseidon. So his lineage apparently traces to a god. And of course, the best I can make of this is it's something like the American grandmother claiming some relationship to Jesse James, as mine did. And I know many other American grandmothers from the early 1900s may have claimed, because I don't know why American grandmothers like to be related to Jesse James, but it just seems to be some staple, or at least uncannily common claim made by our American grandmothers. Jesse James wasn't even that great of a dude, as far as I could tell. He's kind of took the law into his own hands many times, which maybe at sometimes is necessary, but I think ultimately I'd probably want him behind bars if I had the choice, if I lived around his time and in his place. Regardless, I think this is probably a common thing among nobility as well. They probably often claim some lineage to a god. You can think of it as having some particular connection to a god and probably seeking extra favors from that god, is my guess. But it also probably provides you some cool leverage to tell your friends that, I'm from so-and-so family from the lineage of Poseidon. Anyway, he grew up during this Peloponnesian War, where we witnessed the shattering of the Athenian Empire and that strife between the oligarchs and democrats. So ultimately, this would all play into his later politics, or disdain for politics, as we'll find out. And interesting, one of his relatives was Critias, and another Charmides, but that Critias was a student of Socrates, as I just told you, who was one of the 30. And Plato was also at this trial according to Plato's work, of course. So we're taking his word for it that he really was at this trial in the words of Socrates. Of course, all the words of Socrates, let me clarify that, all the words of Socrates we have are through Plato's writing. So it's ultimately Plato putting those words either in Socrates' mouth or accurately recording the words of Socrates. This is also why it's so difficult to separate the thoughts of Plato and Socrates, in my opinion, because I can imagine he was writing this down as the trial went on. He probably recalled a lot of this and probably dressed it up a little bit as well. Most Greek historians and ancient historians in general tended to dress up their history as well. So I think that's probably what's going on with this trial of Socrates as well. Plato probably inserted a few things for effect, or just merely to clean it up. But Plato had early ambitions in politics. His relatives were leaders in the Tyranny of the 30. Again, that was 404 BC. So he was about, in his 20s around that time. And interestingly, he was actually even offered to join them in the 30. I don't know if he was offered to be one of the 30. That seems like a stretch, but he was probably joined to have some smaller role under the 30s, my guess. Wisely, he did not accept it immediately, and he waited until their ultimate policies were revealed, which led to him being repulsed by their policies and their violence. As again, they were very cruel, killing something like 5% of the Athenian population. And the condemnation of Socrates by the Democrats later revealed to Plato that he could really get along with either of them. So Plato was really put off by politics at a fairly young age. Again, probably his 20s or something. I guess he would have been, throughout his 20s, he was undergoing this discernment between the Tyranny of the 30, which again only lasted 8 months. Luckily, he didn't take part of it. And then this condemnation of Socrates by the Democrats. So ultimately, this dampened his goals in politics. He was put off by the what he would think of probably as utter corruption of the government. Instead, he decided to take up his travels, and he headed off to Italy and Sicily. But according to Plutarch, who I really loved reading, I highly recommend going to read some Plutarch as soon as possible. He may have even gone to Egypt. Again, these are all connected by the Mediterranean Sea, so it seems plausible that he could have sailed from Italy and Sicily to Egypt, or perhaps in the reverse order. But the most important thing he did in Italy was to meet a friend and future friend, but also foe later, Dion. He then returned to Athens to found the academy, the famous academy, in 387, and probably had finished some of his writings by that time. He may have written the Apology by that time, but I couldn't find a real date put on the writing of Apology or many of Plato's works. But he wrote them at some point, probably by the time he was established in the academy. This academy served as a central part of his life, as most of us would probably think of him. That's what he's perhaps most famous for besides his works. And reportedly lectured with no notes. So I think of him as some genius professor. If you've ever been in a physics class or something, you know the extra genius that comes with not requiring any notes on the part of your professor. He just has it all in his head. But the general idea of the academy was Plato as this professor type character putting forth research questions toward his students that they could study and then begin to answer. The academy studied philosophy, law, and mathematics, and was sought by the broader world commonly for legislative advice, which again later will bring Plato kind of back into politics, mostly against his will. In fact, but this came through his old friend Dion. Dion was close to the new king of Syracuse, Dionysius II. And he wanted Plato to join him in helping to tutor this new king. Plato reluctantly agreed because of two things. One, his friendship with Dion, whom again he met in Italy. And two, he says, lest I might someday appear to myself wholly and solely a man of mere words. So he didn't want to be a hypocrite, and he wanted to actually practice what he preached. Plato, in his teaching role of the new king, unfortunately quickly led him into politics. As you can imagine, if you're teaching the king how to read, write, and think, essentially, he's ultimately going to bounce his ideas about the running of his kingdom off you as well. And that's exactly what happened. And ultimately, Plato was brought into the state affairs of Syracuse, and hence into politics, where he originally wanted to be, but was quickly turned away by the goings-on of Athens. His political stint in Syracuse ended sadly from disagreements with Dion and Dionysius II. I don't believe the initial order of the falling out. Eventually, he's done with it all and returned to the academy until his death around 347 BC. Where we must note, of course, when talking about Socrates, you have to talk about Plato, and when talking about Plato, you have to at least mention the name Aristotle, who was at that same academy around the same time, probably around 367 BC or so. Of course, we're going to be getting to Aristotle in the future. He's certainly on the reading list here, so I don't imagine many episodes will pass by without talking about Aristotle's works. That's it for Plato. Let's briefly talk a little bit about, here's first of all, show this. This is the School of Athens, that's the academy. I don't know how realistic this depiction is. This is a painting by Raphael, the famous Raphael in 1510 or so, and shows Plato in our middle here, talking with a young Aristotle, as we just mentioned. And you can see they're all kind of these, I think of these guys sort of like hippie philosophers. They're all probably drinking wine or whatever, around the academy and discussing the latest research problems proposed to them by the great Plato. But this is that famous painting, or I don't remember exactly where this is located. I think it's located in somewhere in Italy, of course, I guess. But yeah, famous painting. Should be aware of it. Now I can briefly mention whatever we know about Socrates, and I know less than what's known out there in general about Socrates, since I'm only consuming some subset of information about it. But from what I saw and from what I read, Plato, he at one time was a soldier, so he's certainly no coward, and that plays ultimately into his bravery as well later. He used to be a soldier, and a quite brave one at that, as he is credited with saving a fellow Greek, I forget his name, Alcibiades, something of that kind. And his conscience drives him from thought of ever being a politician, sort of like Plato, but it seems like the way it was said here, Socrates kind of knew it a little bit earlier than Plato may have. He's quite poor, not a rich man, and he describes himself as a teacher or philosopher, notably one who doesn't take pay, which begs me to ask, I don't know how Socrates made a living at all. At one time, he actually did have some brief stint in politics, though, even though he said he never wanted to be a politician. Apparently, he was a senator from his tribe in Antiochus, and he did have a family, namely, most notably 3 sons, which about the time of his trial, they were all roughly teenagers, or maybe perhaps a little bit younger. It's harder to define what they mean by almost grown men and what we mean. Typically, I think the ancients, civilizations, usually they grew up a little faster. So whereas we think of as a grown man as, say, beginning maybe 18, they might think of a grown man as several years earlier. But that's about all I know about Socrates. He's really a mystery to most people, and everything we know is basically told to us through Plato. And this is the most famous painting about Socrates by Jacques-Louis David in 1787, The Death of Socrates. And here he's taking this cup of poison. It's a poison from something called hemlock. That ultimately kills him. But that's really outside the scope of the apology work, since he does not die within the boundaries set by the work that we're reading in the apology. That comes a little later. With that, I really want to go into some of the open questions that I think I've laid really the groundwork behind the work. I've summarized it, provide a little context outside of what's going on historically. And now I think we can talk about some of the open questions, which is really where the interesting part of all this comes in. So one of the questions I first have is, what did Socrates really do wrong? And on reading that closely, I kind of gathered the main, I think, maybe 3 or 4 accusations against him. The first accusation against him, not necessarily in order, just the first one that I'm going to be talking about, is, I'll say it in the words of Socrates. So this is a direct quote from Socrates. Socrates is an evildoer, and a curious person who searches into things under the earth and in heaven, and he makes the worse appear the better cause, and he teaches the aforesaid doctrines to others. This is Socrates kind of playing the part of one of his accusers. It's kind of a little odd to explain, but yeah, Socrates is putting himself in the shoes of his accuser and saying what he thinks they're going to say about him. Namely that he's an evildoer, though he's a curious person, but he searches into things under the earth and in heaven, which in my mind that seems like it's just about everywhere that I can think of, but I would think of namely of the pragmatic things and the lofty philosophical things. And this is the interesting line, he makes the worse appear the better cause. So it seems like in some ways accusers are saying Socrates inverts the proper hierarchy of things. And then they say he teaches the aforesaid doctrines to others. So he spreads it to the youth is really where they're going with that line. Yeah, and that last line is ultimately inflaming the youth to question in general. It was never clear exactly what Socrates was telling the youth, at least in my reading. But it seemed like a general kindling of questions in the youth. Perhaps the youth are now coming to their elders or the prominent people in the Athenian society and asking them all these probing questions that ultimately dive in and hurt the ego of these elders or higher-ups in Athenian society. Another accusation is that he's a teacher. I think I mentioned this briefly, as he described himself a teacher as well. But he's a teacher that gets paid money. To us, that seems like a very strange accusation, as I would say that seems reasonable. He teaches, even if not in a very official sense. It seems reasonable that he could get paid for it if someone wants to pay him, or he asks for payment and they give it to him. Nonetheless, this seems to be a taboo type of thing to do in Athens at the time. So his response is that he doesn't, but he does note what I think many of us might point out. But he says, but being paid to teach citizens would be a great honor. So he kind of voices what I think is that, yeah, it seems totally reasonable to voice someone who's imparting wisdom or any kind of teaching to the youth. It's ultimately the building of citizens is education. So it seems reasonable to me. Regardless, that was one of the accusations against him. A third accusation against Socrates is that he is a, quote, villainous misleader of youth, end quote, because he inspires the youth to mimic his challenging of the so-called wise. Yeah, I think this is part of just his accusers not wanting to be bothered by all these youth. They get all these annoying questions that, again, I think ultimately hurt their ego, and I think that's ultimately the driver of why these, namely three accusers, have come forward. Those accusers are Meletus, Anytus, and I forget the third one. What's his name? I forget the third one's name. But Meletus is the most often mentioned one by Socrates. And I think we already talked a little bit about that misleading of the youth with that first accusation as well. One of those accusations was, things up in the air. He teaches things up in the clouds and under the earth, and having no gods, and making the worse appear the better cause. This is kind of a rephrasing of what Socrates initially, the way he initially phrased it, but I think this was in the words now of Meletus. So I'll read that again. Quote, he teaches, quote, things up in the air and under the earth, and having no gods, and making the worse appear the better cause. The interesting thing about this specific phrasing is that he's repeated one of the initial accusations, namely teaching things up in the clouds under the earth. But then he throws in this other accusation in the middle of having no gods. So now he's calling him an atheist on top of these other accusations. To me, this is kind of what happens when you point out the weakness in one person's argument and they see it themselves too. Then they throw in some other accusation as well, or some other point as well, to try to move the conversation to a different point that they think they might be stronger on. And then further, Meletus charges, he's made several charges, but namely his big ones were corrupter of the youth and not believing the gods. But Meletus says again at a later point, in quotes, Socrates is a doer of evil, who corrupts the youth and who does not believe in the gods of the state, but has other new divinities of his own. Which that's even more interesting now, because now it's changed from being an atheist to having divinities of his own. Now he might just mean divinities in a smaller sense, not in a literal sense of different gods, but perhaps different. Perhaps he means more of a new philosophy of his own that doesn't include the gods. But I just think it's interesting. It seems that Meletus' chart keeps changing the more we read on. And then there's that general accusation, Socrates is a doer of evil. I mean, that seems like a tough claim to back up, first of all. It seems like just color commentary. Anyway, that's one of Meletus. Meletus also claims that Socrates is an atheist, as I mentioned, and he says this further at another point where he says, quote, I assure you, judges, that he does not believe in the gods, he means. And who does not believe in the gods of the state? Oh, sorry about that. Let me reread that. Quote, I assure you, judges, that he does not, for he says that the sun is stone and the moon is earth. End quote. Another interesting quote because, I would say the sun is stone and the moon is, or the moon is made of, something like earth. That seems fine by the standards of where science was in their day. Ultimately, the sun and moon are material, but it seems like this is suggesting that to say the sun and moon are material rather than some deities themselves is sacrilegious in some way. Although in our modern world, even among theists, there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying the sun is stone and the moon is earth, because we don't worship the sun and the moon. Socrates' response to this was very clever, because what he does is he separates the belief in the product of something with the belief in the source of that product. And he ultimately finds that, if you believe in the end product of something, you must believe in its source. And the way he says this is following. It's a little bit of a longer one, so bear with me. Quote, did ever man, Meletus, believe in the existence of human things and not of human beings? I wish, men of Athens, that he would answer and not be always trying to get up an interruption. Did ever any man believe in horsemanship and not in horses? Or in flute playing and not in flute players? No, my friend, I will answer to you and to the court, as you refuse to answer for yourself. There is no man who ever did. But now please to answer the next question. Can a man believe in spiritual and divine agencies and not in spirits or demigods? End quote. I love this quote because I think it makes a great point. If you believe in, say, spiritual things, you must believe in a spirit of some sort. It's kind of a different interpretation of it. But I love that the kind of snide response. Did ever any man believe in horsemanship and not in horses? He's kind of being a little tongue-in-cheek here, because of course the answer is, if you believe in horsemanship, you believe in horses, because one comes directly from the other, and that's his point. He says, I study the spiritual things, the things of the gods, so of course I believe in the gods as well. I think really, as I've stated already, I think one of the real thing that gets the ire of these accusers is that he has poked holes in their egos, ultimately. I think these are fairly powerful people who bank on having a strong view in the public's opinion, and hence they have a large ego. So Socrates, through his various questionings, I don't know where and when or how those conversations really went, but based on how they're going in this public court, they seemed like they probably got fairly heated. And ultimately he has dampened their egos, perhaps in front of other people as well. You got to imagine many of these conversations probably weren't private. I doubt they were sitting, say, at the bar table, whatever that analogy might be in their day. Maybe they had bars, who knows. But I doubt they were sitting in the corner of the bar discussing these things. It was probably in a more public place, and it kind of looked like a battle of the wits, where you might have onlookers who are perhaps supporting their respective champions, and being publicly humiliated or shown to be intellectually inferior, would not be good for your overall outlook of the other person. And then, interestingly, another quote that I like is this one. It says, quote, "And yet I know that my plainness of speech makes them hate me. And what is their hatred but a proof that I am speaking the truth?" End quote. That's Socrates, noting that, and he notes this actually in the very beginning of the Apology, I speak a little different than most of you. I think because he's just not I don't think it's that he's from a different region. I think that he generally is not perhaps as formally educated them in some way. But I'm not sure on this, and that's something I would have to look into more to find out if there ever really is an answer. But ultimately he says he kind of has a plainer, I think of as a more perhaps rural way of speaking compared to the high up politically. And the next question I want to ask is ultimately, especially when he gets these accusations about poisoning the minds of the youth and that sort of thing. Ultimately, it must boil down to some ideas that he's put in their head, right? And a good question to ask is, first of all, a very fundamental question, is what makes an idea good or bad? And I think I've got 4 possibilities. I think there are more, but the brief time I had to think about this, I came up with around 4. One is I think the weakest idea of what makes an idea of good or bad would be popularity. This is like a democratically deduced truth. I don't think many people would buy this one. It's just whatever most people think. Although I think we do often fall into that trap unwittingly. I think often we look at what the majority opinion might be on some subject and try to just go with that. I know that happens a lot with in scientific works. You know, we think, okay, majority of scientists say so we'll buy that too. Now, when it comes to an area far outside your expertise or even interest, I guess it's fine. But ultimately, we would rather be able to look into these things for ourselves and decide, even against the majority opinion, if that's where our conscience really leads us. Overall, though, popularity, I think most people in a serious debate would say is not the arbiter of what makes an idea good or bad. Another thing that might make an idea good or bad is whether it hurts us or an institution in some way. And when I think of it personally, does this idea that this person is proposing hurt me personally? Will it injure me in some way? Will it hinder me? Will it reduce the amount of money I have? Will it take away something, some sort of my property or power? Will it reduce my status in society? You might think of, we might personally think an idea is good or bad based on what it does to us. I guess the flip side of that is not such a negative thing, but does this particular idea make me look good? Does it make me think better about myself? Does it make me feel better about myself? And that might influence what you think is good or bad, or true or false. But ultimately, I think that's a pretty weak one too. I think most people would agree it's probably not what makes an idea good or bad. The last 2, I think, are the strongest. And one of those is its effect on the outcome. So, does this good idea lead to good or bad results? I think this is a good, strong argument to make. Good ideas produce good results. Bad ideas produce bad results. Of course, then you have a question of, are these results really good or bad? That's a discussion for later, I suppose. And you might further ask, is this a measurable thing? And in some ways, you might think of this as you kind of think of it as economic policy. Does this, say this tariff or this particular tax ultimately have a good outcome or a bad outcome? And is that measurable? Economics should have some measurability to it, of course. But when we apply this to other things, it might be a little harder. Especially since really economics can impact many other areas when in totality might turn something that's good economically into something bad socially, for example. Then lastly, there's this idea's relation to truth, or what is true. So a good idea is concurrent with what is true, or in some way reflects what is true. A bad idea will reflect something false. And in my opinion, I ultimately think it comes down to kind of a mix of the last 2. Ultimately, a good idea must reflect some ultimate truth, but it ultimately and very often should have good outcomes from those good ideas. Those are just my 2 cents, and I'd like to hear what you think, especially this particular question. So let me know again in those comments below, what makes a good idea and what makes a bad idea. Another open question is, in this process, this apology is ultimately a court of law where Socrates is on trial. And ultimately a trial comes down to what are the true facts of a case, and what's lies or what's misdirection that the court should ignore. And the question I would like to ask in this particular case is, who is the arbiter in Athens of what is true and not true? Socrates provides a very strong case. I mean, maybe we're getting a light version of that case through the eyes of Plato, who, of course, has these sympathies toward Socrates. maybe the case was drastically different, and Plato ignored all the true accusations, or at least the severity of them, and has tainted our view of Socrates. Perhaps that's true. But ultimately, I'd like to pose the question: who is the arbiter in Athens of what is true and not? Again, you could go back to: is it a popularity contest? Does the populace, does the democratic view of what is true, is that real truth, or is it just the popular opinion? You might think in a kind of novel form of democracy that we found in ancient Greece, pure democracy, which to my knowledge hadn't been practiced elsewhere. But again, that's to the limited extent of my knowledge, a non-historian, just a fan of history, as Dan Carlin might explain himself. I think I would take on that as well. But I would at least like to say, perhaps that novel idea of democracy may have influenced what they think of as true or not true as well. Maybe their sense of democracy influences what they might say is a false idea or a true idea, or what's good and bad. And this democracy may have infected the court to where if enough people want some outcome of this trial, then they're going to get it. That may have actually been the case of Socrates. So I think there's some large number of judges. I think I saw something like there might be 500 or so judges for this case. I don't know how that works in practice. It seems like a chaotic mess compared to what we're used to in the modern world, where we have a single judge and then maybe a set of jurors who ultimately decide the case. But when you have 500 judges, I think they just cast votes. So it is kind of a democratic court, as I was alluding to. So maybe what is true, at least in law in Athens here, is whatever the majority of the judges think. And Socrates' trial was ultimately a popularity contest. Those who didn't like him voted him down, and those who supported him, or at least maybe felt neutral to him, wanted him to be free. Now let's get to the big question. These are the really big question that I don't know if I can adequately answer, and I don't really claim to. I'm not claiming any true answers here, just what I think. So this question is, what is wisdom, first of all? Because a big theme of this work, and I think I've understated so far, and I apologize for that, is the idea of wisdom, because ultimately Socrates is claiming to this trial, this court, that he is the wisest, per the words of the oracle Delphi. And his whole quest, since hearing that proclamation by the oracle of Delphi, was to find out if it's true or not. His whole goal, according to the Apology, was to find out the truth of whether he truly really is the wisest in Greece, or at least Athens, because I don't imagine he traveled too far to find this out. But that quest for truth ultimately led him to question people and to find out whether they were smarter or wiser than him. And eventually he found out they weren't, at least in his opinion. He thought they weren't. So this asks us, this begs the question, what is wisdom, first of all? Now the definition, which often are just useless. I mean, the textbook definition of wisdom is the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. The quality of being wise. The last one we can throw out, because then you have to define what is wise. Let's focus on the first. The quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. All of those kind of need their own definition as well, but experience, I would agree with that. You need some experience to be wise, likely. Knowledge depends of what, I suppose, and good judgment. That's very qualitative, but I think the ultimate key word there is judgment. You have to be able to pass some definitive statement about certain problems that are going to arise in your life. But anyway, on to what I think about wisdom, and ultimately I hope this opens the door to what you think about wisdom. And again, drop in the comments below, what is wisdom to you? In my opinion, though, I formed this not over just reading this work, to be fair. I formed this opinion over reading several other works. I'm sure we'll get to them eventually. But the first aspect that I think is absolutely essential to wisdom is humility. And I think Socrates makes that very clear in this work, and Plato likewise. Because ultimately it's Socrates' self-realization of his ignorance that leads to his being able to claim superior wisdom over all those that he questioned in Athens. Let me read a couple quotes that kind of highlight this. I found the men most in repute were all but the most foolish, and that others less esteemed were really wiser and better. The second quote is, well, although I do not suppose that either of us knows anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing, and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. And that's Socrates after discussion with a purportedly wise politician, whom he found out, though this politician claimed to know many things, he found out he actually didn't know much about those things at all. And Socrates claims in the end, and kind of concludes after many discussions with not only politicians but artisans and orators, all these different types of somewhat high up positions, though they're perhaps not the highest positions in society, quite well-off people, about what they know and what they don't know. And he finds that the majority of them, or actually all of them, excluding himself, think they know something that they don't. And this ultimately is the key to why Socrates is wiser, because he doesn't even pretend to think to know anything. Socrates knows he doesn't know much, and that's what makes him wise. He's a self-realization about his ignorance. That allows him to actually give a little bit more honest answers about things, I think. But ultimately, that really highlights the key component of wisdom, in my opinion. First, without humility, you cannot be wise. I can't think of someone you would call wise that isn't humble. Of course, when you talk about wisdom, you would immediately go to someone like King Solomon in the Bible, and I don't see any evidence until perhaps later in his life where humility isn't at least a reasonable assumption to make about him. Regardless, that's one of the three components of wisdom that I've kind of written down here for myself in my notes. Another is universality. I think, in general, wisdom isn't something that's usually applied to some just narrow particular problem. It's something that generally can apply to very broad problems across, perhaps even across different cultures and regions. When we think of, little proverbs or wise sayings, and they're never these particular, niche subjects. They're not about niche subjects, about some esoteric field. It's usually something very practical that most people can relate to. So I think wisdom crosses borders readily. I think there's a very universal, global nature to wisdom. Perhaps what we think of wisdom in one culture might not perfectly align with wisdom in another culture. That might be a little different, but I think ultimately the problems that we face here in America, the base level, human problems, are really the same quite across the world, and wisdom is the secret knowledge that can solve many of those human problems, or at least make them less bad. Wisdom is kind of an antidote to the human condition. And the third component of wisdom that I've thought about is a certain pragmatism. Wisdom is never pie-in-the-sky theory. It's always applied to very particular and well-defined problems. I think, again, this kind of ties into the last statement I made about universality and the human condition, but it's ultimately pragmatic because it helps us solve aspects or derivatives of that human condition. The fundamental problems we face, disagreements between our neighbors and how we treat our enemies, that kind of thing. Things that have existed, same problems that have existed throughout all of history. That's my bit on wisdom. If you got more things to add, again, drop them below in the comments. That's what this is here for, to actually discuss about some of these topics. And again, I'm going to try to respond to some of these in future videos. Maybe I can make some kind of follow-up videos to answer some of the prominent comments I see in the future. But especially, I'll definitely respond in the comments, and we can keep that conversation going. And things that I really love, I'm going to bring out into the videos in the future as well, because I'm here to learn just as much as you are. That's, again, I want to point out, I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. I'm just reading the works, providing my comments, so we can begin some conversation that otherwise wouldn't happen. But because of some of the technology we have at our hands, the ease of putting things on the internet now, and our ability to connect globally, it makes that conversation very possible. Another interesting question, got a lot of quotes for this one. This is, was Socrates arrogant for claiming to be the wisest? And I think this is an interesting idea because a lot of times we tend to hero worship the characters in these older works, especially. In some way, they almost become cartoonish. We kind of lose the personhood behind them. Socrates is really just a character in our heads or on the pages that we read about, just like we might read a Marvel comic and pick out these characters there. We really crush the dimension to the human when we write them down on a page, it seems. But was Socrates arrogant for claiming to be the wisest? I think this is an interesting question because he's got a lot of backup for his claim. He actually made some verifiable claims, as I'll read to you. But you got to think also that anyone who claims to be the wisest, even if you got sources to back it up, you're still kind of a jerk for even just saying it to anyone. So it's almost like his quest to discover if this Oracle of Delphi is true or not is kind of some self-serving, like super ego project for him, where he can just find out that he really is wiser and smarter than everybody else. And so one interesting reading of this work is just view Socrates as some jerk who really thinks he knows everything better than everyone else. I think it's important to do because, again, these characters weren't perfect. Socrates likely was not the saint we make him out to be in this work. He certainly had his own flaws. And I think one of those flaws might have been, maybe there's a little bit of a provocateur in him that just wants to provoke problems and get people fired up a little ways, even if he had good intentions. Maybe he didn't go about it in the most gentle way. Perhaps he could have been a little nicer about it. Because he would call people out straight to their face, which is admirable. Sometimes I think we need a lot more of that. I think sometimes we're too afraid of what people think. But, maybe he could have toned it down here and there, depending on, just maybe he lacked a little compassion for the person he was talking about. Anyway, he claims that the Oracle of Delphi declared him to be the wisest, and he actually is a witness for that, which the witness was in court. He even pointed it out. I believe, who is this? The witness was Chaerephon, which I mentioned was the one who I think asked the question. Chaerephon was the one who went to Delphi. Actually, let me back that up. I'm not sure he was the one who was at the trial either, though. But he names the man who ultimately talked to the Oracle of Delphi. And Socrates says this about the Oracle of Delphi episode in general. I'll read this quote. It's a little bit long, but bear with me. Quote, "Well, Chaerephon, as you know, is very impetuous in all his doings, and he went to Delphi and boldly asked the oracle to tell him whether any one was wiser than I was. And the Pythian prophetess answered that there was no man wiser." End quote. So, yeah, that's his rendering of the account. Pretty short and sweet. But again, he claims there was another person present with Chaerephon who heard this directly from the Oracle of Delphi, and that person was at the trial as well. So, he had some backup. He had a first-hand account, or at least I guess this would be a second-hand for him. But he had an eyewitness there. Anyways, back to the question. Socrates on why he is hated by the examination of a supposedly wise politician. This is another quote. It says, quote, "When I began to talk with him, I could not help thinking..." Let me interrupt myself. This is back to the idea that Socrates might just be a jerk after all, because this one really pointed out to me. Anyway, this quote says, "When I began to talk with him, I could not help thinking that he was not really wise, although he thought he was wise by many, and still wiser by himself. And thereupon I tried to explain to him that he thought himself wise, but he was not really wise, and the consequence was that he hated me." End quote. I love this just because of how honest it is, because it's exactly what you would expect. I would expect him to hate you when you point out to him that he's not wise, even though he thinks him wise. So you kind of get the exact result I think that most of us would expect from prodding someone and telling them, "Hey, you're not really wise. You're actually, you don't really know anything. You're full of it." Anyway, I love that quote because I think it does bring out that jerky attitude of Socrates in some way. But I will say Socrates does have, besides the eyewitness account of that Oracle of Delphi incident, he does actually have some good claims. One of them is that he really only claims to have wisdom attainable by man. I think this is important because he distinguishes it from a superhuman wisdom that others might claim. So in his mind, he's kind of got two different levels of wisdom. There's wisdom that, a man can reasonably achieve, and then there's this superhuman wisdom that all these politicians and artisans and poets and playwrights think they have, but they don't. So he's trying to bring them back down to the normal human expectation for our wisdom, that we don't have any divine wisdom, at least in the view of Socrates, and I think probably many of his fellow Athenians probably thought similarly, I would think. Then I'd like to read another quote, again about Socrates on his own wisdom. It says, quote, "And I am called wise, for my hearers always imagine that I myself possess the wisdom which I find wanting in others. But the truth is, O men of Athens, that God only is wise. And by his answer he intends to show that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing." He's not speaking of Socrates. He's only using my name by way of illustration, as if he said, "He, O men, is the wisest, who like Socrates knows that wisdom, in truth, is worth nothing." I think this is, again, giving Socrates a little credit in the area of humility, which I think is ultimately necessary for wisdom, as I mentioned. One that he says, "Look, guys, it's not that I'm wise because I was put on a pedestal to rule over you with my superior intellect and wisdom. It's that he's using me, the God above." I'm assuming they mean Zeus here. Sometimes he says God and I don't know who he means because it seems to be pointing out to a singular God, but of course they lived in a society that believed in a plurality of gods. But the idea is that Socrates is saying, no, they're just using me as an example to show you guys, that you don't know anything, and I'm just a pawn in this message from above. And that, because I know that wisdom requires a self-awareness of my ignorance, you should likewise humble yourselves, really, and do likewise to achieve true wisdom. The other thing I wanted to point out is that when I mentioned the Oracle at Delphi episode, I wanted to point out something, just curious little wordings. I don't know if this is the result of just translation from original Greek or not, but note that the Pythian prophetess answered Chaerephon about Socrates when she said that there was no man wiser. Now, when I would pose the question, who is the wisest of all mankind, perhaps, I would expect an answer like, oh, King Solomon is the wisest man of all the world. Very straightforward. But this phrasing is more like King Solomon is the wisest because there's really nobody else wiser. That's kind of how I read that line, and I think that's digging into it a little bit, to be fair. But it's worth noting and thinking about that phrasing, that there is no man wiser. Almost like, Socrates is the wisest because he's really the best we've got. All the others think they know something. At least Socrates knows he doesn't know anything. So, yeah, he gets the title. So it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, I think. Got a lot of notes on this topic, so we could go on this for a while. But the last thing, I'll read this one. This is the last quote I have for it, so we might as well go through it. Anyway, Socrates again talking about kind of his humility in his wisdom. Says, quote, "Whereas I know but little of the world below, I do not suppose that I know, but I do know that injustice and disobedience to a better, whether God or man, is evil and dishonorable, and I will never fear or avoid a possible good rather than a certain evil." End quote. Anyways, he's just admitting again in the beginning of that statement that he doesn't know much of this world. And he doesn't suppose that he knows. But he does know some things. One thing he knows that injustice is wrong, and disobedience to a higher power is wrong, or a higher authority. And one thing that's worth noting, I think we're going to get into more of later in Plato's other works, is that Socrates, and likewise probably Plato too, held the state and law in very high regard, probably much more so than myself as an American would. They almost hold it to a divine office. So it's interesting to keep in note that they had a very high view of law and the ruling powers. So they highly valued obedience to these authorities. Now, next question. Another big topic. It's hard to hit wisdom and follow it up with another one. But another one is that I think is highlighted through this work is virtue, because Socrates in his Apology really alludes to virtue quite a bit as one of the ultimate reasons for his prodding of questions and the ultimate reason why he's here on trial. Anyway, definition of virtue is fairly mundane. It's behavior showing high moral standards. Doesn't leave you with much to think about, but I think reading Socrates through Plato gives you a much better idea. One example of virtue that Socrates shows is when he contemplates whether to act in accordance with how he thinks he might be sentenced. And what he says is this, quote, "A man who is good for anything ought not to calculate the chance of living or dying. He ought only to consider whether in doing anything he is doing right or wrong, acting the part of a good man or of a bad." End quote. This immediately, the first thing I think of with this is, again, this is, I'm quite biased toward Western civilization and, of course, to the winning powers of World War II as well as the United States. The first thing I think of are Churchill and Lincoln when I think of this quote. He ought only to consider whether in doing anything he is doing right or wrong, that no matter how difficult the choice is, and the stakes of the choice, no matter how high they are, and no matter their likelihood of success, that we should choose what is right over what is wrong. I think Churchill was a man who stood up to enormous pressure to back down over intervening over Nazi Germany's invasions of Eastern Europe, particularly Austria and Poland. More so Poland, I suppose. Austria was kind of lost before they even knew about it. But I think of Churchill in that instance with the tough decision that to go to war with Germany over the invasion of Poland. That was something that I don't think the previous leadership of the United Kingdom would have done, namely Chamberlain seemed to bend to the pressures internally as well as externally, whereas Churchill, he stood upright for what was right. Lincoln, again, in the face of a nation being torn apart, decided to do what was right, though it was unpopular. Economically, perhaps unsensible. There's some debate over that as well, about the economics of slavery, but ultimately Lincoln stood up and did what was right, even if it meant fighting a terrible war to do justice. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that particular quote. But he mentions virtue throughout several times more. When Socrates actually gets his sentence, which is a sentence of death, he actually could have maybe gotten away with a lighter sentence, but he didn't really back down from how strongly he stated that he would rather die than change his teaching or change talking about the things he's been talking about. Basically saying he would continue on no matter what. No matter what you do, I'll keep going, so you might as well kill me. But another thing he requests, which highlights his high value on virtue, and acting right and doing what's good, is this quote. Quote, "When my sons are grown up, I would ask you, O my friends, to punish them." Strange quote so far, right? And he continues, "And I would have you trouble them, as I have troubled you, if they seem to care about riches or anything more than about virtue." End quote. So he says, be a pain to my children if they care about things above virtue, if they care about fame and riches above doing what is right. Any good father, I think, should want that for their children. Not to do what is easy for them, because they'll end up spoiled brats that don't know how to behave in society, and they'll go after the wrong things. But you have to be hard on them initially, such that they learn virtue as well. Another quote on the subject is the following: "To discourse about virtue, and of those other things about which you hear me examining myself and others, is the greatest good of man, and the unexamined life, otherwise the unexamined life is not worth living." Here he's saying, at least from an intellectual standpoint, the discussion of virtue is probably one of the most fulfilling. And examining your life, I think later on we're going to read more about what's called an examined life in other works. But certainly Socrates did this, and he examines himself in this trial, probably long before it. And he knows that one of the perhaps some of the greatest conversations men can have is about what is right and wrong and these higher sorts of things. And that it's extraordinarily important to examine our lives to properly order them correctly. If we haven't examined our lives, we hardly know who we really are, and how are we going to act in other situations where tremendous pressure, like the pressures that were put on the United Kingdom in World War II and on President Lincoln during the Civil War. You're probably not going to be able to face up to those pressures without some intense self-examination about what you stand for. Anyways, that's my thoughts on virtue at the moment. Another thing we might ask is, how, at least personally, how high do we hold it, and how prominent is virtue in our minds at the moment? A lot of times we might throw it away for stupid things of the day, like what's on TV, and we distract ourselves with so many things that it seems like we probably don't self-examine ourselves, many times throughout our lives, and I think that's a real shame, and certainly something worth doing. Not saying that I've done it often enough, but I think that's one of the important things. Me being Catholic, I will say that the one time you certainly self-examine is in confession. It's not a fun time for me. I don't enjoy it, but it does provide that dedicated time to self-examine and confess the things that you are not proud of, the things that you know are wrong. Another question is, who is hurt more by evil, the victim or the perpetrator? Now this question really Socrates directly answers. Not that not that you have to agree with this answer, but he provides an answer, and I think it's an interesting answer, not the one that you would normally think, not the one you would, if you went on the street and asked 100 people what they would say, I doubt many would say this. But who is hurt more by evil, say perpetrated by a certain person? The victim or the one who does the evil? On the face of it, we think, okay, someone does evil to someone else. I would rather not be on the receiving end of that evil. I mean, nor do I want to be the person doing the evil, but I really don't want to be on the end of that evil. I don't want to be the one who gets robbed from, who gets shot, who gets betrayed by a friend. But Socrates does make that claim that it's really the perpetrator of the evil who gets the worst end of the deal. And he prophesies, in fact, that the greater judgment on his judges on this trial will come to fruition after his death. I don't know what happened, actually. I think that's another interesting thing we should look into is what happened to these judges, or did any of them ever express any remorse for the death of Socrates after this trial? I think it'd be interesting to look for. But Socrates does make that interesting claim that, and I think it's ultimately the at least Christian doctrines have reflected that the people who commit sin are in more danger, eternally at least, than those who are the receivers of that, say, sinful act. Those who do evil face a higher punishment than the punishments that evil causes on this earth. Got 2 more questions, so let's get to them. Again, hit the comments up. Let me know what you think as well. How would we stand in the face of death? That's a tough question. Socrates, standing, I picture him alone in the middle of some large Colosseum-like building. No, I'm sure it wasn't quite that large. If there are 500 judges, by one source that I read, it's probably not a huge building, but it's enough to where you're certainly sitting in front of a crowd. And you're sentenced to death, and you just got to imagine that with, the other emotions you've got to have going on would just be crushing. But he stands tall. He stands very tall. And he says the following: "Understand that I shall never alter my ways, not even if I have to die many times." End quote. That's a great one. Basically saying, I believe in what I've been doing and in my quest for truth, and you can kill me, but that's the only way you're going to stop me from, the only way you're going to stop me is killing me, basically. No other punishment will suffice, because I'll wind up here at trial. Either I wind up, and one of the interesting things, you say, okay, he could run away and go to a different city. I think this is brought up more in the next word, Crito, but it was brought up briefly in this work as well, the Apology, that even if he goes into exile and goes to a new city to start teaching and kind of talking about philosophy as it was here, perhaps also poking the egos of other people in other cities, they would also similarly come to hate him and ultimately put him on trial and sentence him to death as well. So he thought it fruitless to delay that punishment. He then goes on to explain that he hasn't failed to secure his freedom from a lack of words, but by his refusal to defer to baser means. This is another interesting. So a lot of people faced with such a sentence might ultimately play kind of an emotions card. You might break down, you might get down on your knees and start begging your judges to not kill you. He didn't do that. He says also he could have played the family card, another emotions card, probably even stronger than getting down and crying, and bringing out his family, almost like a lot of politicians do, to get you to like them. They bring out their family and show you what a nice family they have. which is good. Of course, I'm all for politicians having nice families, but using them as kind of a prop for some purpose, some other intent. He points that it's wrong, especially in this case, because interestingly, he really stresses that he would rather have the judges judge him rightly or free him on the merits of his case, the merits of his innocence, rather than just using words and emotions to get them to agree to something, to let him go. So he really cares for that rule of law to have a definitive clearing of his name, rather than just using his words manipulatively, like the sophists would do, to get some outcome. And he says further, a couple more quotes. Quote, "For neither in war nor yet at law ought I or any man to use every way of escaping death." That's a good one. Saying that we shouldn't always run from death. Sometimes death is perhaps what we were meant for. And he goes on to say further, this really belongs back on the question of virtue, I think, at least as evidence of where Socrates stands. He says, quote, the difficulty, my friends, is not to avoid death, but to avoid unrighteousness." End quote. That unrighteousness is worse than death. Again, that is very much in line with much of Christian thought throughout the last 2,000 years. Of course, which was ultimately influenced by Plato and Aristotle. I often think of Christianity as kind of a merging between the kind of the moralities and more of the moralities from Judaism and the practices of Judaism, combined with kind of the logic and broader philosophies of ancient Greece. This is a brief, small side note. His consciousness, he actually refers, talking about Socrates, he kind of refers to an inner oracle that I think is really just his conscience. But he also mentions that he has lots of visions and dreams, so he kind of has like a prophet aspect to him as well. But he calls it this inner oracle, at least in the translation that I've read, which confirms that. Let me back up a little bit. He's used this inner oracle, i.e., a conscience, is what I call it again, to kind of feel out whether he's doing something right or wrong. So I think it's safe to say it's conscience. But the thing he noted about this day of the trial is that he said, throughout this entire trial and throughout the sentencing, nothing in my inner oracle has sounded off some alarm bells, which means all is right, that perhaps death is what I was meant for. And he concludes further about death. He speaks about it. It's a little bit dark, but also I think the attitude that is best and kind of has a very heroic aspect to it, that there's no fear of it. Or at least if there's fear of it, he's showing courage to stand tall in the face of it. But he concludes that further that his death must be good. For if there's only unconsciousness after death, death is, quote, but a single night, like sleep. But if it is more than that, then he has all of eternity, meaning if there's something like heaven, I don't know what the Greeks might have called it, but for me that sounds like heaven. Then he has all eternity to converse with the great minds, free of judgment. So it means, you know what, either I sleep soundly after death, or I go to this heaven-like place where I can talk and talk about philosophy and all these things that you guys really hate me talking about, and they don't have to worry about their egos being hurt, and I don't have to worry about the judgment of the people there. So he kind of concludes that, I win either way. Again, think of that time he said how his perpetrators would be hurt and judged worse than he is now. And I think it's worth noting the concluding line of the work. I think most works, it's probably notable if the writer, really put a nice end to it. The last line is, quote, "The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live. Which is better, God only knows." End quote. Gotta love that ending. Because again, it invites the reader to think about, what is better, particularly in his situation. Socrates, is this his time? Is it better that he dies now than later, or that he dies at the hand of this unjust trial rather than some natural death, maybe a decade later or less? He was actually quite old during this time. I think I read he was around 70 years old. I think in his own words he says that in Plato's Apology. And I guess I can't call it his own words. It's Plato's at least recreation of Socrates' words. He's an old man in this, so he doesn't have much time left regardless. That brings up the last question. Again, all these questions, let me know what you think in the comments as well. Last question is, what effects on the world is Socrates choosing death? When I say choosing, again, I'm assuming, and I think by reading it you get an idea that he could have probably gotten away with a lesser sentence had he been kinder with his words and less resolute in the fact that he would keep on teaching no matter what. But what effects on the world did Socrates dying have? And I think if we look back to the bio of Plato, I think it's fair to say it's quite possible that Socrates' death is ultimately what led Plato to take up traveling and philosophy, and ultimately become such a powerful force in Athens with his academy. It might be that if Socrates had lived on and died maybe 5 years later from old age or the usual suspects in human death, Plato might have lived a quite different life. Maybe he would have turned back into politics. Maybe he would have changed of heart about it. And maybe he wouldn't have traveled so far and met so many diverse ideas and to form his ideas. And maybe he ultimately would have never written down this story of Socrates, his trial. Maybe Socrates' entire life would have died in utter darkness had Socrates not physically died to inspire Plato to go on. And of course, if Plato hadn't taken up philosophy and created the school at Athens, Aristotle might not have happened. And just think of all the multitude of effects that would have had on the Western world. Perhaps the Western world wouldn't even exist, at least in the form that it is now. Maybe our sense of right and wrong and what it means to stand up in the face of death and bravery would be quite different. Interesting thought. Again, I want to hear what you are thinking as well, as this is as much of conversation as you can get out of a podcast like this. Comments are really where we can actually talk about things, and then I can address them in future episodes and kind of progress in that way. But that's it for the main questions, and that's really the concluding question for this podcast. I thank you all for joining me, and again, if you want to help out the channel, please like, subscribe. It'll really help out this new channel on the great works of Western civilization. I'm going to put some links probably in the notes below, but where you can get a good reading of Plato's Apology if you haven't read it, or if this has inspired you in any way to read it. The books that I'm going to be reading from throughout much of this podcast, unless I deviate here and there, I might do that. It's from the great books of the Western world, which I highly recommend. 52 volumes, I believe. This is a 1952, no, perhaps it's 50 volumes, or maybe 52 volumes, but it's a 1952 edition of the great books of the Western world. Fantastic set put together by Robert Hutchinson and Mortimer Adler out of the University of Chicago, again in the early 50s. But it's a fantastic set, has really the foundational works of the West, and those are more or less what I'm going to be following. I'm not going to go through every work in it though, because there's some more obscure works that I think either I don't think I can draw enough out of them after reading some of them, like Gargantua and Pantagruel is one of them. It's really odd work. Not many people have read it. So I'll probably stick to the more well-known books, and I'll also let you know kind of where I'm going with this series, so that you can read up if you have time for it, or you can just be prepared for what the next episode is going to bring about. So, again, this is supposed to be somewhat of a discussion. Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, so you can help us out here at Thinking West. Check out ThinkingWest.com. It's my personal blog where I write about things related to these, but I kind of focus more on little pieces, little aspects here and there, rather than a gigantic approach to a work like Apology like this. This also might be focused on things kind of in the peripherals of Western culture and civilization. A lot on Christianity and religion there as well, because that's ultimately my upbringing and where my beliefs lie. Of course, you're open to think differently than me, of course. That's part of what the discussion is going to be all about. So, I really want you to like, subscribe, share it around as much as possible. Those you think that would be interested in this kind of thing. Covering the great works of the Western canon. Again, nothing on the Eastern canon, but I think the West is kind of where I am right now in terms of mentally thinking about its philosophies and history as well. So with that, thank you for tuning in for the first episode of the Thinking West podcast. And I will next be going to another work by Plato called Crito, which is a direct follow-up to the Apology. Another short work, so you can certainly read it in time. Expect to release that approximately about 4 weeks after this one. We'll see how it goes. Maybe sooner if I can get to it, but we got Christmas coming up, so thank you for joining us, and have a good one.